I was 12 years old when I had the opportunity to live with him. And I was a very angry 12-year-old boy because I grew up in South Africa at a time when there was a lot of prejudice and people of color were hated and abused and insulted all the time, every day. And I was beaten up by people, and so I was very angry and wanted to retaliate. And that's when my parents took me to India, and I had the opportunity to live with grandfather. And the first lesson that he taught me was about understanding anger and being able to use that energy constructively and intelligently rather than abuse the energy. He said anger is like electricity. It's just as powerful and just as useful, but only if we use it intelligently. But it can be just as deadly and destructive if we abuse it. Even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world. And because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty, and that is violence against humanity. I'll tell you a story that my grandfather used to tell us, and it was his favorite story. It was about an ancient Indian king who once became very curious about the meaning of peace, and he invited all the intellectuals in his kingdom to come and explain the meaning of peace. And everybody came there and did their best, but nobody could really satisfy the king. And then one day, an intellectual from another town came on a visit, and the king asked him the meaning of peace. And he said, the only person who can give you a satisfactory answer is an old sage who lives outside your kingdom. But he is so old that he cannot come to you. You will have to go to him and ask him this question. So the next day the king went to this sage and asked him the meaning of peace. And he came back with a grain of wheat and placed that grain of wheat on the king's palm and said, here is the meaning of peace. And of course the king didn't know what a grain of wheat had to do with peace, and he didn't want to show his ignorance. So he quietly clutched that grain of wheat and went back to the palace, and he found a little gold box, and he placed that grain of wheat in the box. And every morning he would open the box to see if he could find an answer, and he couldn't find any answer. So a few days later, when this intellectual came back on a return visit, the king asked him to explain. He said, this sage gave me this grain of wheat, and I don't know what this grain of wheat has to do with peace. And that's when he said, it's very simple. He said, as long as you keep this grain of wheat in this box, nothing is going to happen. It will eventually rot and perish, and that will be the end of the story. But if you had planted this grain of wheat outside in the soil, it would sprout and grow, and very soon you could have a whole field of wheat. And that is the meaning of peace. That if somebody has found peace and if they keep it locked up in their hearts, it will perish with them. But if they let it interact with all the elements, it would sprout and grow, and very soon we could have a whole world of peace. So I have come here today to give you the grain of wheat that I got from my grandfather, and I hope you won't let it rot and perish.